What is going on, guys? Today I'm going to be giving you the buyer's guide to a 350Z. This is going to be a lot of information, but at the end I'll give you the basic breakdown, the pros and cons to each year model of the 350Z. So stick around. Alright, so up first, we should know that the 350Z was made from 2003 to 2009, and there were three different models within those years. You had the VQ35DE, you had the VQ35DE Revup, and then you had the VQ35HR. So I'm going to explain the differences between those and what to look for if you're buying one of them. So we're going to start with the VQ35DE, as it is the first generation of Z. It was made from 2003 to 2005, and it was in the 2006 automatic models. Alright, so first thing we are doing is talking about the difference in the engine. With the VQ35DE, you have a single intake and throttle body, which is going to be the major giveaway of this engine versus the HR. So the VQ35DE is notorious for the third gear grind. The transmission was not that great in this year model. It is not really a matter of if it'll happen, it's more of a matter of when it will happen. So if you own a Z within those year models, you can expect to develop a third gear grind if you don't have it already. It's just something to look out for. So towards the end of 2004 and into 2005, there was a revision made on the transmission for these cars. It ended up with the CD009 transmission, which is a very good transmission, and it fixed that third gear grind issue. However, if you were buying a 2004 350Z, it is something to try and find out of whether you're going to have the CD00A transmission or the CD009. If you can get the CD009, get it. You will thank yourself later because you will not be having grind issues with third gear. So what everybody wants to know is the horsepower. The first iteration, or the VQ35DE, came with 287 crank horsepower, which really comes out to about 240 wheel horsepower. But by this time in their age, they're starting to see more around 230 wheel horsepower, just because of age of the engine. So with this engine, some will experience oil consumption. That's one thing that you're going to hear a lot about these VQ engines. People bash on them all the time for oil burning, but there are plenty of good ones out there that do not burn oil, so do your due diligence when looking for one of these. And the last worthy note about the engine on the VQ35DE is that it has some weaker internals, which means if you're planning to go boosted, you can only safely go to about 400 wheel horsepower before you're hitting that range of running into throwing a rod. Alright, so that's something to keep in mind when you are buying one of these, is that the DE, the engine in those, the internals, will limit you to right around 400-ish to the wheels. Some people have seen 450, but that's starting to push it. Better be safe than sorry. Outside of the engine, there are some differences that happen visually. For this year model, 2003 to 2005, the biggest visual difference are the headlights. So with these headlights, it came with two light bulbs, and there was the option of the HID bulb for the low beam or a normal halogen for the low beam. The high beam, however, was always a halogen high beam. The other visual difference is it came with halogen taillights, and we will get into the difference into the next year model, which is the Rev Up. So now we've made it into the Rev Up, which was made only in 2006, but it was also found in the track edition of the 2005 350Z. The Rev Up came with a whopping 300 crank horsepower, which transitioned into about 250 wheel horsepower, and now with the age on them, they're starting to see around 230, 235. So in this model of the Z, you had the revised transmission, the CD009, which eliminated the third gear grind as mentioned in the previous model. This engine also came with stronger rod bolts, different cam profiles, different intake plenum, stronger oil pump to handle the higher revs. And the higher revs that I just mentioned in the previous model engine, it only revved up to 6,500 RPMs. The Rev Up revs all the way to 7,000 RPMs. And this is because of the different cam profiles as well as the variable valve timing that was added to the exhaust cams. So what's worth knowing about the Rev Up is that from the factory there was a handful of engines that came with their piston rings improperly set. Because of this, the engines burned oil, which is what most people have bad to say about the Rev Up. So many people will tell you that the Rev Up was the worst engine of the Z engines, and that's because they always burned oil, but that's not actually true. There was only a group of them that came out of the factory with the piston rings improperly set. So if you're looking at a Z that has the Rev Up engine, it is worth asking who you're buying from whether there's an oil consumption issue or not. Now, there was a recall for this issue, so if you do get a Rev Up, there is a chance that there is a brand new motor in it. Also, if you get one under 60,000 miles, you may still be able to take that recall and go get a new motor put in it, which would be awesome. So, arguably, this engine is actually the best for forced induction due to the stronger internals and still having the availability and cost of the kits for the DE. Now, we get into the visual aspect that changed in the 2006 model. So, now the headlight only comes in one style. This also transfers into the HR model that we will talk about later. And that is a single, large, bi-xenon, dual beam projector assembly, which is using an HID bulb. So this headlight has a motorized shutter inside that allows you to transition between your low beam and your high beam setting. Along with the headlights, the taillights were different. Instead of the halogens from the previous model, you now had LED taillights, which is great. Now that we've covered the DE and the DE Rev Up, let's get into the HR. So this was the 07 and 08 model, and there was an 09 Roadster that was made that also had this engine. So this was the third revision, and the intake manifold changed. You now had dual intakes, and there was a bump on the hood, and the bottom end was strengthened. This engine produced a even greater 306 crank horsepower, which came out to about 255 wheel horsepower. Now, out of all the engines, the HR engine responds the best to bolt-ons, which is great. Typically, with full bolt-ons, you can make it to about 300, just a little bit over 300 wheel horsepower, which is pretty solid. That's a good number to be at. Now, the slave cylinder for these engines on manual transmission HRs was inside of the bell housing of the transmission. And to go along with that, they were super weak, which meant they would break. Now, to change them, you would have to drop the whole transmission. That was a pain. There are relocation kits for them. Z1 sells them. If you don't know who they are, it's Z1 Motorsports. They're a great company, basically have everything for the Zs, but that's not what this is about. Now, another issue that the HR had was low oil pressure problems, and this was because of the oil gallery gasket. They were made of paper and often crumbled within the engine, which then you would run into low oil pressure. Now, the DE and Rev Up also have the same oil gallery gasket, but they did not crumble as easily as they do on the HR engines. So it's not seen as a common problem for those previous year models. Now, for the transmission, it is slightly different from the CD009, but also relatively similar. There was no grinds, it's a very good transmission, very sturdy. And lastly, we are going to get into the visual of the HR. There is only one difference from the Rev Up, and the differences from the Rev Up to the DE carry into the HR. The HR had a bump on the hood, as mentioned earlier. Now that we've gotten through all of that information, let's break it down into the pros and cons of each engine model. Alright, so The good things about the VQ35DE: they are super cheap to modify, they have a crazy amount of aftermarket support, and they're really easy to find. There's tons of DEs out there for sale, so this is the majority of what you're going to see in your search for one of these cars. Now, the bad things about the VQ35DE: they do have the lowest horsepower of the bunch. They also come with a pretty rough transmission. The third gear grind is almost a guaranteed on every single car with that transmission. And by this point in their life, the majority of them have high miles. So those are the pros and cons of the VQ35DE. Up next, we have the pros and cons of the VQ35DE Rev Up. Now, good things: they have higher revs and higher horsepower. So you can crank it up to 7,000 RPMs, which is fun. And you get a little bit more horsepower out of it. Second great thing: they are super cheap to modify because it is still a DE. It has the same intake manifold, which means your bolt-ons are going to be the same for the DE and the DE Rev Up. What this means is that you have tons of aftermarket support for this engine. To go along with the aftermarket support, you're going to have stronger internals, better headlights and taillights, and the better transmission. Now, the cons of the VQ35DE is that you have the chance of having oil consumption, and the oil consumption is pretty bad when it's bad. Other than that, that's just about it. I actually own a VQ35DE Rev Up, and I have no issues with it. Mine doesn't even burn oil. So it's one of those engines that you're going to have to find out its history behind and then make a decision. Now we get into the HR, and the great things about the HR is it is an incredibly strong and reliable motor. It is a very well engineered motor, and surpasses the VQ35DE and Rev Up by a very large amount. Another great thing: it is far more receptive to bolt-on modifications. And the last of the pros for the HR is that it is the fastest of the three. It will put a couple car lengths on a normal DE, stock for stock. Now we get into the bad things about the VQ35HR. It is almost twice as expensive to modify due to the dual intakes, and it is more expensive to purchase because they are generally seen as the better car over the other ones and generally have less miles. Also, because it was only made for 2 years, it has less aftermarket support. There is not as much out there for the HR engine as there is the DE engine. And the last two issues with the HR is the oil gallery gasket problem. It is not difficult to change, but you will have to take off all of the timing cover. So it's a give and take, do you want to do that? Because it probably will happen. And the last thing was, the slave cylinder sucks. You have to drop the entire transmission to change it out. So that's another con of the HR. As for my final recommendation, if you're looking for a Z, I have to tell you, be patient. Alright, there are plenty of well cared for Zs out there. Most people that have an opinion about the 350Z that's awful or think that it has an awful engine are because they owned one that was trashed. There are a lot of them out there that have been trashed and destroyed, and then they sell them for cheap. People buy them and then think they're a terrible car. They're not. You wait, find a good one. It's okay to pay a little bit more for a good one. I promise you it'll save you problems later, and you will love it, alright? Other than that, you have to respect it for what it is, okay? It is not going to be something that you're going to chase down a Z06 Corvette in. You just won't. It's a car from 2003 to 2009. You're not going to chase down a brand new Z06 in it, alright? But if you love it for what it is, you're going to have a lot of fun in the corners, and the drivability of the car has a very raw feel, alright? It is very driver friendly. So learn to drive the car and you will enjoy it a lot more. And lastly, I want to thank you for watching the video. I hope this cleared some things up for you if you're looking for a Z, or if you've just recently purchased one and you're trying to figure out some things about it. If you haven't yet, tickle that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and go take a look through the channel. Now I want you to comment down in this video if you have any other questions about the Z. I would be happy to answer them, and I want you to make an informed decision on your next purchase. I'll catch you in another episode.